Good morning. So for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Angelica and I'm on the Public Square team at Democracy Funds. You may also know me from my newfound fame on the cover of the MIF program and on the MIF website. Nina, Vince, I assume my check is in the mail. But allegedly, I'm actually here to talk about elections and journalism. So why I chose to do this now. In early 2020, I was about 10 minutes old in philanthropy years, give or take, and I feel like I went kind of trial by fire into a major boom cycle in funding and in collaboration in response to everything that happened that year, which I won't re-traumatize us with in this moment. And while collectively, I think we did really valuable work and moved a lot of resources, I was struck continuously by how reactive it felt. I think I was perpetually a deer in headlights. And ever since, I have really wanted to go into 2024 in particular in a different mode and with a different frame. And even if I don't have the ability individually to move resources, I want to be most helpful to anyone who does, particularly across Democracy Funders at large. So I couldn't think of a better way to go about this than to go directly to the source and hear what our grantees want us to know before going into this next presidential cycle. They are the experts, they are on the front lines, so I tried to talk to as many folks as I could in our grantee network. This was mostly journalism grantees in our portfolio, as well as a group of Democracy Funds voting and elections program who have particular experience working with reporters and developing resources for reporting. So fundamentally, what I wanted to know is what are the threats and opportunities for our grantee network? What are the impacts of the flow of resources on their work, and specifically, how can philanthropy respond? So let's start with what we heard. Here's a breakdown of the problem in some pretty broad strokes. Likely, I think what you're seeing here isn't a huge surprise, but I still found it enormously clarifying to see it in one place. And the thing I really also want to highlight about what I heard is that these aren't just the problems of an election cycle, although that's how they read. They are the problems or challenges of reporting for democracy, full stop. And if we want to address the needs of journalism in this moment, then we have to think about, or in a moment of crisis, we have to think about what it means to support journalism's role in the democratic system overall. So let's get into some of the specifics. I was really humbled by the clarity of our grantee messages. They did not hold back. Their sense of urgency and commitment was very strong, and also, in particular, their willingness to take on an enormous amount of risk. And one of the things I want us to reframe is the idea of who takes on risk when we do funding. These are legal risks, they are physical risks, they are personal risks, they are professional risks. And if this is conveying a sense of urgency to you, then I'm doing something right, because that was what came across in over 10 hours of talking to folks. So the path to getting to the actual actionable civic news and information that we need is really riddled with roadblocks. And what we heard, and what I think is also likely very intuitive to all of you, is that the threats and challenges keep growing exponentially, or at least our awareness of them. I think a lot of them were always there, and we weren't paying attention. So they're getting in the way of actually producing the news and information that people need to vote and to be generally engaged in democratic processes. The volume of what one person really lovingly described as shenanigans is enormous. And this is what journalists and voters and audiences have to navigate to get to the brass tacks. Journalists are actively experiencing digital, physical, and legal threats. and that requires scenario planning and emergency response. I think this is a way in which the journalism system in the United States is actually starting to look a lot more like what we're used to seeing outside of the United States, and this is a sea change. There are some resources out there, and I think we heard about some of them yesterday, and they help in some respects. They help for some individuals. They're mostly in the form of PDFs and training, but they don't have the localized context. And why this matters is for reporters who are reporting on the roots of political violence within their communities. And that's what's missing. It also doesn't come with a hotline. And so when there's a real threat, people need actual real humans to be able to respond. We have legal hotlines in our system. We do not have emergency physical safety response hotlines in our system just yet. Burnout is also real, and the election cycle makes it a lot worse. The coverage boom during an election season is exhausting for reporters. It is also exhausting for audiences. I know it was exhausting for me. I'm sure it was for you as well. But it leaves newsrooms even more underwater than they already are. A major issue within this overall capacity challenge for newsrooms and for the journalism system is that there aren't enough BIPOC reporters in larger outlets. And there's insufficient capacity for ethnic community and independent outlets who are covering local and state government. And I think Tracy spoke well to some of this. Diversity in newsrooms needs to be present in political reporting and in editorial leadership, and we are not there yet. I can't drive this point home enough, and again, echoing Tracy just now. If we care about elections information, if we care about democracy reporting, then we have to focus on communities of color and traditionally marginalized communities. Any threat or challenge that you can name is more urgent, more acute, more targeted in those communities. People of color are deliberately targeted in disinformation campaigns. And I think Imara Jones outlined so beautifully yesterday, this is one of many tactics that are absolutely by design. The result is demonization, it's divisiveness, it's disenfranchisement, and suppression. But also, the same problem that has been true for a really long time is still the case, which is that political money has an overwhelming influence on our system, and it's channeling profits to commercial media. These are really powerful incentives for sensationalized content and polarizing content. And we heard over and over again how much this disenfranchises people from reading the news, from consuming the news. The impact is that it obstructs the ability of local and community news to leverage marketing in an election season. And it also runs completely counter to and drowns out their civics and democracy narratives. So money is flowing, and it's making a whole lot of noise, but it is not translating into investment in local coverage. And this is the result. Very proud of my visuals here. I hope you enjoyed them. This is what takes up most of the oxygen, particularly in a presidential election year. I hope this is resonant for you as well. There's also a lot of toxicity and divisiveness in these narratives that is fueling the distrust. We're not paying enough attention to what's below the surface. So here's what's below the surface. This is just one representation. It's not the be-all, end-all. But what I hope that this really visually drives home is the enormous volume of what's needed that's not visible. And it's not just about the volume, it's also about the complexity. Because our election system, again, by design, is fragmented, as is our local governance. So, decisions about how elections are administered are not attached to election cycles. They are made year in, year out, in legislative sessions and in government in every jurisdiction in the country. Okay, so gird yourselves, get a little comfortable, because you and I are part of the story. Grantees had a lot of feedback for us I'm going to go through this part pretty quickly because it also shows up in the recommendations, but I just want you all to be mentally prepared. So if this makes you cringe, as it should, that is absolutely the correct reaction. Poor funding practices are contributing to fatigue and scarcity. Scrambling for small temporary grants are usually not worth the effort, and newsrooms are increasingly just not going after these opportunities. Sometimes these cohorts don't even come with that additional 10K of funding. We heard this across the board from newsrooms, but once again, it's also particularly acute for newsrooms led by and serving people of color, whose leadership are now really sought after by us. Those leaders are getting more and more recognition individually these days, but it's not translating into the resources going back to their operations. So that's a problem. I think this also reinforces, and our grantees absolutely did talk about what Sue just shared about the challenges of project funding. So our timing also matters, and I want you to think about actually where we are in this cycle today, which is already sort of on the cusp. Money that comes in right before a general election is too late. It's too late to make a meaningful impact on reporting for that particular year. The election isn't on election day. It starts the day the first primary ballot goes out in the mail. And that is months and months before Election Day. And if money only comes in during a presidential election year or election season, then we are at best supporting a quarter of the needs and capacity for reporting on our election system as a whole that is active and relevant year-round, 12 months a year. Okay, so take a deep breath. Because we also heard from grantees in every role in the system, from reporters to elections experts, that there are opportunities and solutions. Grantees told us repeatedly, a rigorous democracy beat is the counterweight to authoritarianism. There is an opportunity to provide steady and ongoing coverage for democracy with local relevance and national context, but it requires intensive time and resources. And when reporters are consistently able to pursue those stories, and I again point to Translash, to MLK 50, who we heard from yesterday, as amazing examples of this, they build trust over time with reporting through journalists who represent their communities, that provide accountability and counter authoritarian tactics and messages. Ultimately, what we want to achieve is a different cycle that reinforces a healthy news and information system. So what reporting on elections actually requires is the sustained investment over time. And this is what I believe initiatives like Press Forward hope to achieve and inspire, and I think it's certainly at the heart of strategies at Democracy Fund. But the health of both our elections and democratic systems is dependent on this continuous access to quality and actionable information that also proactively reaches traditionally marginalized people. And that brings us to why we're here, potentially at MIF. We have the opportunity, while we're gathered, to learn from each other and to shift the way we do things. I went into this very clear-eyed that I'm not going to solve these problems right out the gate on my own, either for philanthropy or for Democracy Fund, as we are rounding the corner on November of 2023. But I'm hoping that actually you will help me build on these together. So these are roughly in 3 categories. First, there are actions that are truly viable in 2023 and 2024. And this is what we heard that could be really helpful in coming months and in the long term. And the takeaway here is that as funders, we really have the power to trust our grantees as stewards of funds and offer them the flexibility that they need. Also in the short term, if you're looking to support elections reporting more directly, there are a ton of existing options. We're going to talk about this in the breakout session. Lizzie from North Carolina, Rashad from New Mexico, and I'm hoping also Allison from Delaware are going to talk about some really great examples of local funding and opportunities. I'm also trying to track these in a larger way, which is an enormous task, so please help if you can. Come find me and we'll talk more. And in the short term, there are also solutions that don't yet exist on a wide scale, and we need some innovation. Grantees named these as really critical needs, either embedded in newsrooms or in the form of shared infrastructure. We can play a role in vetting these services. I also have examples that I can share with you more one-on-one of how we've tackled similar problems in the past, both within Democracy Fund and collaboratively, and I'm attempting to explore this more, so once again, please help. And finally, there is no change without long-term work, which again, I think and really believe that that is why we are all here. Elections and democracy reporting needs sustained support from philanthropy. Grantees have a really clear vision of what's possible if we're able to shift our strategies to think holistically about what needs to change. We need civic news and information, and we need pro-democracy journalism that explicitly upholds our democracy system. Thank you. Please come by at 11:15. I'd love to talk more.